During the session, panelists will explore the practical challenges water agencies face and consider strategies to protect public health without placing disproportionate financial burdens on local utilities and their ratepayers. We're joined today. When you hear anything that closely resembles your name, please come to the stage. We're joined today by Eric Sapirstein, president of ENS Resources Incorporated, which provides public policy consulting. Eric will serve as the session moderator. Joining Eric today will be panelist Dr. Sally Brown, research professor at the University of Washington, Tracy Mehan, executive director of government affairs for the American Water Works Association, and James Slaughter, principal at Beveridge and Diamond. Mr. Sapirstein, I leave it in your hands.
Well, thank you, Fritz. Good morning, everybody. Fritz said the bios are in your Q code or what have you, but I want to just take the prerogative of saying who these folks are. To my left, Sally Brown is a researcher with the University of Washington, but that doesn't explain everything she is. She is an authority on PFAS, can explain a very complicated circumstance of chemicals and what they mean, and is basically going to be able to give us a really good sense of what the real threats are of PFAS. Next to Sally is Tracy Mehan. Tracy is the executive director for the government affairs program at the American Water Works Association, but that doesn't do him justice. He is a past assistant administrator for water at EPA, has an intimate understanding of what these issues are from a regulatory standpoint, a policy standpoint. And last but not least, Jimmy Slaughter, who is a litigator on all things PFAS and solid waste with Beveridge and Diamond, law firm across the country. Jimmy has been leading the fight in trying to clarify what the threats are, legal liabilities for public agencies like yourself. So with that, I just want to start off by first acknowledging Jeff and Steve and their co-chair commitments to make this happen. We are greatly appreciative of it. And more importantly, what you folks do on a day-to-day basis in trying to protect public water supplies and address many of the tough issues that are out there, not just PFAS, is really important. So today's conversation will focus on PFAS, but it's more than just PFAS. It's emerging contaminants across the board. Our panel will go through the policy issues, the regulatory issues, the legal issues, and I think we'll get into a little bit of discussion on the politics of PFAS writ large. After about 40-odd minutes, we'll open it up to audience questions and to get your thoughts on anything we've said, correct or incorrect. So with that, I'd like to start by asking all the panelists, just an open-ended question. Given what's going on with PFAS, federal level, state level, local level, are we in a position where we can fix things, or are we going down this road without any ability to resolve the questions? I mean, what are your thoughts from call it a science point of view?
That word science suggests that I'm supposed to answer first. So we're, as somebody that gets uncomfortable shoes and gets blisters and puts Band-Aids on constantly, the real answer is comfortable shoes, and then you lose the Band-Aids. We're not up to that level of fixing. The real way that you stop PFAS is stop using it in every product known to man. And it is very rare that you see the political will to do that. We have multiple new generations of compounds, and in environmental samples, that means in wastewater plants and in soils, many cases these newfangled versions transform to the dreaded PFOA and PFAS. So even though we've eliminated those from daily use, we haven't eliminated those in the environment. So we're seeing this in rainfall. We're seeing this in multiple ways of household exposure. We're seeing it in water, as you know better than I do. We're not going to stop seeing it until we have adequate source control.
So I thought when you said about adequate source control, Sally, is that probably the reset that we need to do on PFAS?
We're never going to get anywhere on this until you stop putting it in dental floss, mascara, couches, rugs, Big Mac packages, everything. I mean, it's a very useful compound. That's why it's ubiquitous. But do you really need it in dental floss? I'll have you know that Linda Lee, one of the preeminent scientists on this, says that she herself uses the Glide dental floss with the PFAS. So that puts that risk into context. However, you can't win this until you stop putting it in everything.
Very good. So Trace, I want to turn to what AWWA is doing with respect to general issues of being the voice of the water community nationwide. What are your priorities? And maybe you could talk a little bit about the litigation, because I think that obviously is something that has a big point to take.
Sure. I did want to pick up on Sally's point. We use in the drinking water sector the paradigm of source water protection. And of course, Sally, you're going way up.
To rainwater.
To the products themselves.
Oh.
But we've in countless comment letters to EPA have said, what about doing effluent guidelines under the Clean Water Act for sources of PFAS? Nothing's happened, not in the Biden administration. It's unlikely to happen in the Trump administration. What about using TSCA, which was a Toxic Substance Control Act, to kind of, again, get to the sources? We even proposed a RCRA approach to avoid using CERCLA, where you would use CERCLA, but where you follow RCRA, which is the Hazardous Waste and Toxic Waste Substantive Law, Waste Management Law, to fashion programs that target not all of us, not the collateral damage of drinking water utility customers, but actual sources, rather than using a blunderbuss approach like CERCLA, Superfund liability. So, and we've been notably unsuccessful. Everyone wants to devolve back to the Safe Drinking Water Act and put it on drinking water customers. And to Sally's point, the success of the phase out of PFOA and PFAS, and what are blood levels are down 70, 80%.
Yep.
So it works. But no, we're going to do it the hard way. We're going to go to the end of the line and pick the innocent victims and target the regulations for them. And that's where we are now, and one of the reasons why we're in litigation over the PFAS rule and the lead and copper rule.
So on the litigation, Tracy, could you give these folks sort of a 30,000-foot level of what the basis of your litigation is?
Yeah, by the way, if you really want to get in the weeds on this, I have our brief posted on the website, so that QR code can get you to it. And you may be primarily interested in the cost arguments, the benefit cost feasibility arguments, which is, I think, at page 53 of the arguments section. Essentially, we had a Black and Veatch study that, showed the cost were twice what EPA put it at. And we did more than that. Chris Moody, who was in my office at the time, is now with Fairfax Water, went out and tracked down basically 100 case studies of people that have either started to comply with state regulation or already costed out projects. And basically, it was like 300% higher, the actual cost. This did not seem to make any impact on EPA Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water. Again, having served there, whether it's career people, political people, or a toxic mix of both, it's hard to say. So that, and then of course the hazardous index, which is sort of a Frankenstein creation, not contemplated by the Safe Drinking Water Act, that was a screening tool under Superfund, is now being used as a way to get 4 different compounds, throw them together, different endpoints, sum them up and say, bingo, you got another regulatory standard or an MCL. So we're challenging all those issues. Honestly, judges go to law school to avoid doing math, so I don't know whether we'll be able to carry the day on the benefit cost arguments. Hopefully on the hazardous index, which is more of a purely legal issue, we will have some success. And I won't talk about lead and copper rule with this crowd.
So, sorry, did you want to say something?
It's also the studies of cost control at source, industrial sources, a fraction, very small fraction.
Yeah, it's always, prevention is always cheaper than remediation.
Even if you're using it, even if you continue to use it, source control at industrial sources,
So Jimmy.
Well, I agree that lawsuits are not going to solve this problem. It has to be done through the legislative process. These are political decisions about how much PFAS we're going to tolerate in our water, in our biosolids, in consumer products. And as Sally mentioned, it is a very good molecule. It's been around since it was invented during World War II. and it just has properties that have made possible many consumer products. And to this day, medical devices rely on PFAS for its hydrophobic properties, and there are many other products that need PFAS or similar molecules to achieve the ends that we want them to achieve. And so we are making strides. As Sally said, the blood levels of PFAS in mammals and humans are going down. The manufacturers are phasing out the long-chain PFAS molecules, going to shorter-chain PFAS. So, progress is being made, and while I agree source control is better rather than regulating the folks in this room for end-of-tap criteria, we also have to be nuanced about it. Going to no PFAS molecules or no chlorinated chemistry anywhere is just going to exact a huge price in terms of industrial and consumer products and the economy writ large.
So Jimmy, as a follow-up with the litigation, I think you had some slides maybe, or there we go. So maybe you could walk us through some of the circumstances underlying or influencing the litigation that you've been experienced in.
Well, I'm a litigator, but I am the first to say that the morass of lawsuits regarding PFAS is not the best way to solve the problem. But at the outset, I just want to applaud and express my appreciation to everyone in this room, Orange County Water District, MoDOC, and all your sister utilities, including Orange County Sanitation District, that are addressing these issues. And water utilities are caught in the middle. I mean, you're regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. You have a public health requirement to deliver Safe Drinking Water Act. You are a passive receiver of PFAS. You in no way absolutely introduce it. So you're a plaintiff, and I applaud the agencies for participating in the MDL in South Carolina and getting that large settlement from the PFAS manufacturers. And so I'm on the defense side on PFAS, but I certainly understand and encourage utilities that you're incurring a lot of costs for this, and so you have a right to go out there and seek recovery for those costs. But on the other hand, you're also going to be a defendant in lawsuits because the voracious American Plaintiffs Bar looks to get a recovery from wherever they can, and we'll talk some about CERCLA designation of PFAS as a hazardous substance. CERCLA is a no-fault statute, so water utilities can be targeted when their water ends up at what becomes a Superfund site and sued because of the PFAS content and water treatment residuals, or perhaps even the water itself. Your contractors are vulnerable. There's a big class action in Connecticut against some privatized water utilities. The Safe Drinking Water Act does not give as much preemption of tort claims as we would like for what you do. But then ultimately you also have to explain to your customers that their drinking water is safe. And so you're in the middle and at front and center on these big debates. But basically, looking at this slide briefly, the big drivers are, we've had these tort suits regarding PFAS since the early 2000s against the manufacturers. I mean, every big environmental problem in the United States gets a big Hollywood movie with an A-list star. Mark Ruffalo in Dark Waters a few years ago. And the media, of course, is this forever chemicals mantra is just ubiquitous, as you know. So those things lead to lawsuits, public misunderstanding of risk and causation. And then we have an ongoing EPA risk assessment for PFAS and biosolids that's generated a lot of interest. And biosolids are also the subject of a fair amount of PFAS litigation now. Next slide. Next slide. So with these federal actions on PFAS, the general cultural zeitgeist about forever chemicals, we have hundreds of lawsuits ongoing. And most of them, because they started with aqueous film-forming foam, firefighting foam, and it has a heavy level of PFAS in it because of its very good properties for firefighting, That started a lot of lawsuits that were transferred to one federal judge in South Carolina under what's called the MDL, or multi-district litigation process. And that's where you got your settlements with 3M and DuPont last year. That was part of the multi-district litigation process in South Carolina. But there are a lot of states, including California, that have brought lawsuits regarding PFAS contamination. Again, most of it is now being concentrated into this MDL in South Carolina. State of New Jersey, because it had sites within its state that DuPont operated, they kept out of the multi-district litigation, and they got a $2 billion settlement from the DuPont, a PFAS manufacturer, that was announced a few weeks ago. So again, as much as it pains me as a defense lawyer to say this, certainly keep your eyes on the ball about opportunities for other agencies, the state, to get recovery for the costs that you're incurring for PFAS. So that's a quick overview of the litigation. I'm sure we'll circle back to it before.
I do know there are some folks here, Jimmy, they're dealing in wastewater and water. I'm curious, on the PFAS and biosolids front, you're deep in the weeds, or maybe deep in the biosolids, trying to figure out what is or isn't the threat. Anything you can talk about without jeopardizing your ongoing litigation about what you're finding when it comes to public agencies and their involvement?
Well, biosolids are at the front line because, as most of you know, in the wastewater treatment process, the PFAS molecule, it repels the water, it attracts to the solids, very generally speaking. Sally, her knowledge of chemistry can add a lot of nuance to that. So our biosolids are typically going to have PFAS concentrations in the low parts per billion, which in the PFAS world seems to be a lot, given Safe Drinking Water Act standards in the low parts per trillion. And you know from your partners at Orange County Sanitation District that biosolids management is a huge part of the job of every wastewater utility. Recycling biosolids to farmland, which most cities in the United States have done for generations now, is a fabulous recycling process, returning that nitrogen, phosphorus, trace nutrients to the soil, helping farmers. It's a great urban-rural partnership, biosolids use on farmland. But it's in the crosshairs for PFAS plaintiffs' lawyers now, simply because you can find biosolids with low parts per billion, and arguments say, well, it goes to the soil, it gets into the groundwater eventually. Groundwater, of course, in California is defined as drinking water, or it may make its way to one aquifer or even drinking water wells. And while utilities can have sovereign immunity from certain tort suits, which is a great feature of our law, although creative plaintiffs' lawyers often figure out ways to get around it, your contractors don't. And so I've represented Synagro, which is a contractor to a number of the entities in this room, defending its land application programs. And there's a big case in Texas right now brought by the PFAS plaintiffs' bar, alleging that a simple land application event on a farm somehow or another contaminated neighboring property and killed cows. There you go with the dark waters theme again. And the humans aren't feeling very well either, because there happened to be a land application event nearby a couple of years ago. Synagro is aggressively defending it. The science is completely on our side. Synagro is being transparent with its expert analysis on this. So I'm confident that we're going to be able to defend land application from these PFAS toxic tort cases. But again, it just illustrates that even though, of course, wastewater treatment plants and their contractors are passive receivers, they don't introduce any PFAS into the biosolids, just like you don't with the drinking water. You're still going to be sued because it allegedly makes its way to the end user in some fashion or another.
Well, thank you. So I'm thinking about litigation, liability, and I'm thinking, Tracy, you sat in the assistant administrator's chair at one point, and there was a story in the New York Times last week about the current policy gurus, if you will, within EPA, political appointees, putting together a proposed approach to rescind the designation of CERCLA hazardous waste for PFAS. So from your perspective, putting that in context, that there was an effort to address this issue, Lee Zeldin, when he was a congressman, was deep in support of trying to address these issues. He came from Long Island, New York. They had huge problems with contamination of their waters and what have you. Tracy, from your experiences and also now sitting representing the interests on a policy basis for the water sector in Washington, what kind of options does a Zeldin, does a soon hopefully to be confirmed Jess Kramer, Assistant Administrator for Water, what kind of options do they have short of the courts getting involved?
Well, let's break it down. You're talking about the rescission of the hazardous substance designation
Yes.
under CERCLA. It's kind of a cruel irony for us that the administrator seems to be totally committed to the MCLs for PFOA and PFAS based on what he perceives as his prior political and policy position, although that position did not stipulate 4 parts per trillion or any level. But nonetheless, he's very locked in on that. And they are talking about extending maybe 2 years compliance or trying to use variances, which really doesn't work under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Obviously, that one, the lobby from the chemical industry was very successful. And I think that points to really a structural political problem the water sector has. We normally don't do donations, you know, other than maybe some IOUs do. We don't have PACs. We're municipally grounded or publicly grounded. So we, honestly, in Washington, money talks. And it's kind of pathetic to me that you're seeing this inconsistency from the political leadership at EPA, driven, I think, by pretty, clear political, countervailing forces. So as to whether they'll succeed, I think our membership, I can't speak for anybody in this room, but generally through our Water Utility Council, we weren't necessarily against using Superfund per se, but we do think passive receivers ought to get an exemption, the way lender liability exemptions, a whole number of exemptions. So I don't know what's going to happen. We haven't really had a chance to talk about this because no decision's been made where the association will come down on the idea of rescinding the hazardous substance designations, although we definitely think passive receivers like water and wastewater utilities need a get-out-of-jail-free card.
I want to put a finer point on the issue of money in Washington. It does play a huge role. I think what's really valuable is to recognize that on the PFAS debate, folks like Tracy, yourselves having communicated the issue of concern from a public agency standpoint, the fact that ratepayers ultimately shoulder the burden of dealing with the regulations, that it's critical to communicate to your members the importance of putting good policy together. Because we talk, I know Tracy, you probably do this constantly, your staff do it. We talk to members, we talk to the staff that write the laws, that do the oversight in Congress of the agency. And they privately will say, this is a huge issue, both from the drinking water standard side, because it's going to cost a boatload of money, and then from the liability side, as Jimmy and Tracy were talking about. But when the Klieg lights go on and they're asked questions, they basically equivocate because they don't want to get out there and sort of, as Jimmy referred to, the dark waters and Mark Ruffalo's of the world. They just don't want to be caught in that basically crossfire of controversy. So,
Can I just, and I hate to dwell on politics, but you can't take politics out of politics. But, what really is amazing to me, and I served in 2 different Bush administrations, daddy and son, but, in the world I grew up in, so to speak, or worked in, we talked about risk versus risk, benefit cost analysis, opportunity cost, relative risk. I'm hearing none of that from the current Trump crowd. It's all science, science, science. And I said, well, what about, cumulative costs? What about, you're not hearing it. There's an a priori political commitment. And you also see it in the lead and copper rule. They're going to defend the Biden rule over and against the Trump rule on lead. I mean, this is all a new world politically, and I could get into other reasons why I think it's kind of evolved this way, but there you have it.
So I guess this is where I say, how do you really feel about it? But no, Tracy, you hit on something. So what does AWWA think? When you think about lead and copper, you think about PFAS, what kind of costs are water agencies going to be dealing with for compliance, do you think?
Well, there are we talked about the MDL litigation, and technology may save us. My degrees are in history, philosophy, and law, so I'll defer to you guys on that question. But I mean, rates are going to go up. They're going up. They have to go up. Anybody who tells you they're not going to raise rates are lying to you on other things too. I mean, you add the lead and copper rule improvement, LCRI, and the PFAS regulations, probably two of the most expensive regulations in the history of the Safe Drinking Water Act. You add to that all the other pressures you've got, supply chain issues, et cetera, et cetera. Our ratepayers are going to take it on the chin. That's where I see it going. Unless the wheels come off the whole thing. States start returning delegated programs back to the EPA or things like that. But if it stays on this trajectory, it's going to have a material impact on the affordability of water.
So, Sally, hearing all of this, the question that comes to my mind is, when the Clean Water Act was renewed in 1987, somebody made a statement that there's like 60,000 chemical compounds that we've made over the decades. This is a little bit like whack-a-mole. If we take care of the PFAS issue, the two chemicals, and maybe the 4 odd chemicals that Tracy referred to in the hazard index, but what do you foresee with chemicals and compliance and treatment and what have you going forward? Won't the chemical industry just find a substitute?
I'll always have a job. I may not always be alive, but I'll always have a job. A lot of this, and this is gonna be patient here. One of the issues that I see with PFAS is people feel that something's been pulled on them without their awareness, and they feel very violated. And it's also very difficult because it's so unclear what the actual dangers of PFAS are, except that they're huge, except maybe they're not. And it's also very difficult to say what's safe in terms of PFAS, because if you look at the new EPA regs, it's one thing. If you look north to Canada, it's a whole different story. If you look to Europe, it's a very different story. If you look at daily acceptable intake, it's a different story. So I think it's really important for water utilities and wastewater utilities to take control of the narrative, because I think we've really lost it. I think it's really important. Passive receivers is one term, but I think it's super important to have people understand that we make clean water. We make the environment safe. We are not PFAS factories, and that portion of the narrative has been lost. The other thing that's critical for people to understand is there's no more pristine acre. Everybody wants to find that pristine acre where there's no sign of human imprint. But PFAS is coming in the rain. You can't find that pristine acre. So my point is, after PFAS, microplastics, they're already here, right? Who hasn't heard of microplastics, right? And what's going to come after, like lead and gasoline? What came after lead and gasoline? There were new additives and new risks associated with those. So we have to change it so that we are here. Our impact is going to be seen and felt, but it's not always bad, and there has to be realistic ways to say we're here, but we're trying to not do harm and to give people tools to not do harm. So for example, in the wastewater field, there are utilities that don't want to measure PFAS because they're scared of what they'll see. I think that that's a very bad approach. I think you should measure. I think that you should do what you can to control industrial effluent. into your systems. That's worked in Michigan. And then it turns into that the primary source of PFAS into wastewater are people's homes and people's bodies. And that shifts the dialogue to help people understand that they too are passive receivers, and starting the path to fixing it and changing the communication paradigm. And that was a long answer, and thank you for listening.
I don't know if you've heard this, but I hear the argument from the chemical industry that these regulations will end up maybe just offshoring a lot of products.
And that's,
Is
yeah.
that, okay.
Yeah, and this is, yeah.
Jimmy?
Well, I can't resist my constant forays into toxicology, and of course, Sally will correct me, but yeah, that's where the rubber meets the road. I mean, does PFAS cause harm?
It's not clear.
Yeah, the science, I mean, there's so much good peer-reviewed literature out there by toxicologists and epidemiologists and risk assessment scientists who are questioning what the risk assessment field is doing by picking these extremely low limits. And it's not a formula, it's a subjective scientific endeavor where they pick certain studies and not others, and then come up through mathematical formula what will prevent a 1 in a million incremental cancer risk. And the society doesn't understand that that is an extremely safe and precautionary level that, of course, as we've been talking about, costs a huge amount of money. And one of the words regarding the PFAS discussion that bothers me the most is associated. And you see this constantly in the articles about PFAS, that some scientist has, quote, associated, unquote, PFAS with kidney cancer or testicular cancer or some other ailment. Association is not a legal term, and it's a very loose scientific term. What we have to educate the public about is that PFAS has not been shown to cause these ailments on a general level or a specific individual level, except at very high exposure levels. Now, of course, the comeback to that many people ask me is, well, if it's so safe, why did 3M and DuPont, reach these big settlements, not the utility cases, but some of the toxic tort cases brought by individuals? That's because big corporations in America don't want 12 individuals off the street, the American jury, deciding these scientific questions. That's a stacked deck, and there have been some ugly jury verdicts regarding whether PFAS caused the ailment of some very sympathetic and innocent-looking plaintiff. That said, that shouldn't drive our policy on PFAS. That's why we need legislation, not lawsuits, that take a serious look at risk assessment. Steve Sheldon and I have talked about this some. It's not easy to talk to your ratepayers and customers about toxicology, but somehow we have to break through and start to educate people that the cost is huge, as Tracy pointed out, and the risk is very low. There are better ways to spend your budgets than squeezing every last molecule of PFAS out of drinking water.
Can I just, so this is one way I disagree with you.
Bring it on.
I don't think we're going to win anybody over or get any fans or traction or credibility with the argument that this stuff really isn't as toxic as people think it might be, because that makes you look like a bad guy. I think the way you win is saying, we don't want it either. Here's what we're doing to make sure in a cost-effective way that still lets you have as safe as we know it water. This is what we're doing. It's not our job to be epidemiologists or medical professionals or start questioning. That makes you look not so good.
Well, Sally, I like to be the bad guy, but you're right. It's just the communication and public perception hurdle may just be too big, but at some point I think it has to enter at least the policy and the legislative discussion about what level of risk. I mean, it doesn't say anywhere in the Safe Drinking Water Act, correct me on this, Tracy, that we have to prevent a 1 in a million incremental cancer risk. I mean, that was developed over the years through risk assessment and various rulemaking.
Well, I mean, I think from a communications perspective, it's hard to argue with you on that. I agree. But it does go to whether, how do we approach this problem? I mean, again, I think going back to prevention, source reduction, use reduction, rather than trying to treat it at the end of the line and put those costs on innocent parties as opposed to, the polluter. But you're right, that's even a tough call. I think drinking water it resonates as an issue. It has high saliency. It's dormant, but something happens, like in West Virginia, bam, it's a huge issue. I mean, one of the victories we have, or you could, for the temporary, there are no permanent victories or permanent losses, but there was a good part of Congress that wanted to go after the whole family of PFAS, regulate it all, ban it all, et cetera, et cetera. Zeldin, to his, in his defense, might have thought, well, just supporting regulation of PFOA and PFAS is a moderate middle ground position compared to what the other party caucus was pushing at the time. So it's, I mentioned this, I did an article on the 50th anniversary of the Safe Drinking Water Act, and if you take a look at it, the original draft of the Safe Drinking Water Law was called the Pure Drinking Water Law, introduced by a congressman from New York. I think today, the culture, the political process, the corporate culture at EPA is moving back to a view that we need pure water as opposed to safe water. And that's why we're into 4 parts per trillion.
Yeah, that's not attainable.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So listening to this conversation brings me to the question about liability. And Tracy, and Jimmy too, I'm wondering, Superfund or CERCLA, right? It was a hazardous and is a hazardous waste site cleanup law. Is there validity to the argument that the designation of PFAS under CERCLA, the way the agency has gone about it, is novel, to say the least?
Yeah, they didn't go through the benefit cost analysis that many of us think was required, and that's that rule is subject to litigation too, brought by industry people. Superfund's some people love it, some people hate it, but its liability scheme, as Jimmy indicated, it's strict, joint, several, and retroactive liability. And there's 4 categories of what are called PRPs, potentially responsible parties, of which the water and wastewater sector probably checked 2 of those boxes, arranger liability and transporter liability. And even if your contribution, say, to a given site or facility, as it's referred to in the law, is minimal, you could be dragged into very ugly litigation with a lot of risk to your good faith with your customers, your legal expenses, your reputational risk. And again, EPA doesn't sue municipalities, so I'll make that clear. But you'll be brought in by another PRP who's looking for contributions. So we don't need it as a sector, and whatever happens to the hazardous waste substance designation rule, all the water and wastewater associations are agreed we need a CERCLA liability exemption.
Yeah, on that point, either to you or Jimmy, how does liability occur? Is it EPA has a discretionary enforcement policy right now? I mean, isn't that a get out of jail card, so to speak, for the public agencies?
Well, part of the problem with CERCLA is that it empowers private individuals and companies and landowners to bring these contribution actions, but what typically you need to trigger a CERCLA lawsuit is that there's a local, state, or federal action establishing the necessity of a cleanup of a piece of property. And once that the landowner decides that, yes, I am going to clean up my property, then they have the right to bring an action against whoever might have contributed the CERCLA hazardous substances in any amount. And then, as Tracy said, those people who are sued have a right to bring a contribution action. And the problem with PFAS, as we've been discussing, is it's so ubiquitous. It's going to be found in most soil through rain, as Sally pointed out. And if an agency, state agency, establishes a cleanup standard that we have to have no more than X parts per billion of PFAS in the soil, then again, that triggers a right to start litigating over the cleanup cost to meet that state cleanup standard. And it just invites so much litigation. And plus, I mean, sometimes these state cleanup standards, again, are not doing proper risk-benefit analysis here. They're just saying that soil has to be cleaned up to X parts per billion or parts per trillion of PFAS in the soil, and then regardless who contributed how much or how little, they can be on the hook, and they at least have to litigate it.
If we look at history, two law professors out here in California, Buzz Thompson up at Stanford, and Jim Saltzman at UCLA, they have a treatise on environmental law. They came up with a figure of 600 municipal utilities or municipalities. These were landfill cases during the heydays of Superfund 80s, 90s, and that were all dragged into litigation. Not by EPA. EPA doesn't do that, but it's by the other potentially responsible parties. So again, at the end of the day, your payout may be minimal, but you've got to go through the purgatory of litigation and all that entails.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing, I'm looking at Jimmy, I want to acknowledge your comment about the fact that you don't think litigation is the proper way to go, even though you are a litigator. I think that's a commendable position. But I do have a question about how litigation proceeds. It isn't just about you're liable potentially, but rather it's almost like green mail. Bring somebody in to the case so that you can maybe collect a settlement from them, just because it's cheaper, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And just anybody with a law license can bring a lawsuit and copy a complaint off of the internet and file it and see what happens. I mean, frankly, there are not a lot of or any repercussions for bringing weak lawsuits. You show you're going to defend it, and often it'll be dismissed, but still, you have to hire your defense counsel and litigate through at least a motion to dismiss. So, we're talking about CERCLA, then, of course, citizen suits under the Safe Drinking Water Act. I'm sure folks in this room have experience with that. Once these PFAS standards get set, then creative citizen suit groups will figure out a way to allege you're not in compliance, and they bring that federal citizen suit, which carries a right to attorney's fees if they just show one small violation. And so, as you know, you usually have to settle those actions as well. I mean, it would be best if we had good federal legislation, probably under the Safe Drinking Water Act, that says you meet this standard for PFAS, and let's hope the numbers are much higher than they are now, and then state common law tort lawsuits are preempted. There are a few federal statutes that have preemption of tort lawsuits, not many. Most of them have a carve-out that we're not going to get in the way of common law tort lawsuits. But that should be one of our goals. And then the CERCLA has a substance designation. Well, we'll see what the administration does with it. But Eric, as you well know, I mean, there are active groups trying to get a passive receiver provision built into CERCLA, which would protect ideally both water utilities and wastewater utilities that land apply biosolids onto farmland. So, but again, there's just a tsunami of litigation out there, and I hope we can slow it down.
So let's turn a little bit to treatment solutions. I did not do well in organic chemistry, but Sally and Tracy, why is there no treatment technology out there that's cost effective? At least I'm not aware of anything. Or maybe the better way to say is, why are the options so limited?
Do you want me to?
Yeah, I told you I'm a history major.
So if you think about this, you're talking about thousands of formulations of carbon bonded to fluorine, right? And we don't necessarily know all of them, and as they degrade, they don't disappear, the little guys turn into bigger guys. And you're talking about regulated concentrations, not of parts per million. It's really, really hard to understand these units. I mean, we're getting familiar with the term billionaires, but parts per billion is 9 orders of magnitude in the other direction. So if you're focusing on treatment at where we are, at this end, you're talking about such a tiny, tiny, tiny detective case. And we're talking about a kind of compound that's so variable and so flexible because it does so many things that makes it really hard to pin down and capture. And it's in a matrix where there are a lot of other carbon compounds bonded to other things. So it's ridiculously optimistic to think that you're going to find a silver bullet that's going to be able to zero in on this tiny pinprick in this whole Orange County and effectively, without disturbing everything else, fix it, make it go away. I mean, you can add water treatment residuals. Some people do that. You can add char. You can look at my email and see every other day there's a new miracle cure that I should look for. If you just do the math or look at the number of zeros, not going to happen.
I'm speaking out of turn, but I've heard from our wastewater colleagues in Washington that Michigan has a pre-treatment approach.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
is
No, that works great.
Pretty good. Yeah.
That works great. So
I mean, they said that's a reasonable mitigation.
very reasonable mitigation. And the other thing with the pre-treatment that's wonderful is that the cost is then borne by the industry that produces rather than the utility. Super easy. We did, the Oregon has, there's a company in Oregon, Clean Water Services, that did a very similar thing in Oregon, reduces the PFAS concentrations in the biosolids and in what's coming into the plant super effectively. If utilities are empowered to do this, super easy, cost effective, and instead of you're taking it and moving it from the parts per trillion or parts per billion to a parts per million or percentage or potentially even more concentrated, that makes it easier. They know what they're making. They know what compounds they use. Yes. Yeah, that's our easy, obvious answer. And that all utilities, it's very hard because depending on the state, are you allowed to enforce pretreatment for something that's not fully regulated? It's not clear. Michigan, they did it, worked like a charm. We just did a voluntary survey in Washington State of utilities. About 44 utilities participated, and about a quarter of them showed signs of industrial input.
But Sally, isn't the biggest source of PFAS in wastewater homes? People wash their clothes, those Scotch Guard clothing.
There was another study out of the Bay Area, and the biggest industrial source there was laundries, commercial laundries, but people's homes. So domestic flow, if you limit all industrial sources, your domestic flow, and the Michigan regs have this as about, I think it's 20 ppb of PFOA or PFAS as your limit of only domestic flow. There was another study, and my biosolids fondness comes out in this. It was out of New York, and they sampled dog and cat poop as a surrogate for human poop, and big time. So if you want to get scared, analyze your poop. And here, well, I'm serious. You're going to see a big PFAS signature, and we're the source. In industrial pretreatment, easy to control. We should be doing this. No excuse not to. States should facilitate utilities to do this. Absolutely cost-effective, easy answer, and then we get to your own poop, and that's the scary part. And you were supposed to chuckle at that, and I mean, I gave you a bad joke right there.
So before we open it up to questions, 2 other thoughts that I wanted to get your opinions on. The first is, as you look first of all, EPA is a public health agency first, an environmental protection agency second, as far as its charter goes. In some respects, we're in this mess because of particularly on the biosolids front, and it probably translates over to drinking water too. We're in this mess of a policy debate because of some of the assumptions EPA used to get us to where we are today. Maybe open it up to your general discussion, like, how did we get here? Like, the assumptions, the validated science, or was it validated science? I mean, any of you folks want to weigh in?
I gotta go here, I'm sorry. So when the EPA did the risk assessment, one of the issues is in the 503s, the big risk assessment on biosolids, there was a lot of
503, Sally, is the standards for biosolids.
yeah, they're the standards for biosolids. And a lot of research went into this. A lot of funding for research went into this. So here instead, we're having the research, which is in comparison very limited, not funded, and primarily focused on very highly contaminated sites. And so the consultants that did the risk assessment for EPA, they were looking at the one case where biosolids that were land applied were the ones that made the French fry boxes for McDonald's, where the PFAS concentrations were in grams per kilogram. They had other research with normal biosolids, but they were no detect, so they didn't use that. So we have Mount Everest, but we have no ground level. And that's what a lot of the science, so it's left to utilities, and EPA just canceled all this research on PFAS. So we're having such a headache. Yeah. Okay, I'll
You
shut
know,
up.
this is really a deep question because you're talking about 40 or so years of history and cultural evolution at the agency. But you go back to the original distinction that was always made between risk assessment and risk management.
Yeah, we don't
Which,
have both.
which
Yeah, here.
I have to say, I've kind of come around that I'm not sure that's a good idea anymore, that you need to have closer integration between the risk assessment and risk management. And that goes to the fact that you know, and this is controversial, and I'm still trying to make up my mind, the current administration is trying to bring science back into the program offices. And, you know, a lot of people say, oh, it's anti-science, anti-science. Well, that relates to the overall budget, but maybe there's something to be said to getting that closer to the risk managers, so bring a little, how shall I put this delicately, a realistic framework. Yeah. There's also this institution in EPA, and I forget the name of the full name of the acronym, IRIS, Integrated Research, help me. Anyway, IRIS, look it up. That's very controversial now. A lot of the chemical guys want to see it blown up. You can argue about that, but that's, if you're talking about upstream, or I'm mixing metaphors here, blocking and tackling, that's where a lot of the science gets done. A lot of these risk factors get created. A lot of the research, good, bad, and indifferent, starts, and that filters through down into the regulatory programs. Again, that risk assessment, risk management divergence, which, as I say, personally, I'm going through kind of an evolution of my feeling about that. So.
Yeah, and I think on the politics, it's important to note what Tracy's talking about with this rearrangement, if you will, of how EPA runs its work through offices, what have you. You've got the politics on Capitol Hill where they're saying, not so fast, there's this reflexive action. Anything that the administration does is bad, therefore, we're going to say no. And so there's language in the spending bill that's pending for EPA that says you will fund the Office of Research and Development at FY24 levels, which is higher than what the current debate is on what to fund that office. But they're saying, let's just keep that office the way it is. So we have that sort of political dynamic pushing and pulling too. Jimmy.
Just quickly about the biosolids risk assessment. That's going to take years to play out. There are over 20,000 comments on the draft risk assessment. But we have to be aware states are filling that void. And some states, particularly in New England, 1 part per billion was deemed possible risk in the draft risk assessment. And they've, Maine banned land application of biosolids, and some other New England states are probably close behind. Other states, realizing the importance of land application, have taken a much more gradual approach and saying, okay, if you have over 100 parts per billion in your biosolids, then they have to go to the landfill. And California has always been a leader in land application of biosolids. It hasn't rushed to embrace the biosolids risk assessment and set a presumptive level for PFAS and biosolids. And that's where you can all hopefully have a lot of influence in Sacramento to keep California as a leader in recycling biosolids to the soil and not imposing some arbitrary and very low limit for PFAS and biosolids.
So this has been a really great discussion. We've touched on the politics, the regulations, the technologies, and the policy. So I'd like to, the time that remains, we've got about 5 minutes, open it up to any questions from the audience. Yes.
So,
Wait, one second. Here you go.
we've been told, we've been told that it's even possible that we might see some of this settlement money coming to us rather quickly and over time. So I'm curious as to this panel's opinion. If you were a good and wise businessman, would you spend that money when you get it, or would you tuck it into some reserve account against future litigations?
That's obviously not for me.
I think I'd want to hear from your CFOs in the audience on that one.
Jimmy?
Yeah, that's a management decision, but it's a tough one. I mean, as we've explained, I mean, PFAS treatment technology is difficult and expensive for the end-of-pipe issues, and I hope you can spend that money on better environmental priorities than elaborate and expensive treatment technology that may not really bring down the PFAS that much. But EPA keeps extending the deadlines for the Safe Drinking Water Act compliance, so maybe you can do some actuarial work there and figure out when you have to spend it.
We can hear you in.
We can hear you, Steve. We'll repeat it.
We'll repeat it.
I wanted to get some additional information out, because Orange County Water District Board's had to deal with this, and we've tried to kind of research and peel back the science, and as we learned in COVID, we've got to follow the science. So I wanted to just ask the question, I think it's a pretty good yes or no. And generally, you've mentioned that 1 in a million may contract a disease or some injury from the PFAS after consuming approximately 2 liters of water per day for 70 years. And 1 in a million might, is that a correct general statement? That's what we've been told.
Yeah, and it's really, one of the things that's really difficult with the PFAS is it's so ubiquitous. It's ubiquitous. So how do you point causality? And how do you point a source?
That's my next question. Okay, so is it also true that 80% of the PFAS in our bodies doesn't come from water? It comes from all these products.
I don't know. I can say that if you look in the, I just saw a paper trying to see how use of dental floss contributes to PFAS body burden. And they found that, and I may get these results mixed up, but you'll get the point, that if you use dental floss with PFAS in it, you'll generally decrease your overall body burden of PFAS, but increase your PFOA body burden. So in other words, nobody knows.
Well, that's what the researcher on PFAS from UCI told our board. 80% came from non-water area.
And you know what I would say to that? That sounds nice. Ask somebody else and you'll get a different answer.
I don't know, that's a commonly held percentage, I thought, in the industry. I don't know if Jimmy would. Is that the percentages that you've?
I think that's right, because you have Teflon pans, and I'm a very poor cook. I rarely cook, but when I scramble eggs, I want some PFAS on my pan. I'm not worried about the exposure.
My last question is, if 80% of the PFAS doesn't come from water, but that industries aren't being targeted with lawsuits and regulation, and only the 20% is, don't you seem to question the legitimacy of the science?
No, well,
Is it really as dangerous as they're claiming?
So I would say we should talk about this over a beer. But there's
Thank you.
PFAS in beer, so screw that. So each scientific paper that you see, they're doing their best, but they're working in a very narrow vision. So there was another study. The Latino youth have more or less PFAS body burden if they eat out more. And they have more PFAS body burden if you eat out more. But you're taking people drink water, people eat food, sometimes they cook food, sometimes they floss their teeth, sometimes they use beauty products, and trying to tease out an answer here. And the answer that you get, the scientists aren't necessarily, you're saying they're wrong, they're looking at this piece, and it's how much PFAS do we get from walking on this carpet? Can you tell me?
I guess my final last question is that I've not seen a lot of control group studies.
There aren't any control groups.
So here's an example. That's my point. So if you take Orange County, we have South County that didn't consume any Santa Ana River water. It's all imported water without PFAS. North and Central Orange County consumed PFAS in the Santa Ana River water. That's the source for Orange County. Well, I've asked the EPA regulators, why can't you look at South County with Mission Hospital and North County with St. Joseph's, all the same health system, and that's a great natural control group. Yet the fact that they don't have control groups begs the question, because the scientists keep getting millions and millions and millions doing these studies that don't really go to the key problems with control groups.
So I think you have a fantasy version of how much money scientists get, and in fact, that music just emphasized my point now, didn't it?
I think at this point, you've been saved by the bell. Would you please join me in thanking these folks for a very informative presentation?